So we usually assume that, global corruption, tyranny, unjust wars, broken economies, that all of that starts at the top.
Right, yeah.
Like we picture it brewing in parliaments or, I don't know, heavily guarded boardrooms or in the shadowy corridors of the nation state.
Yeah, exactly.
But the structural blueprints that we are looking at today, they make a staggering, totally counterintuitive claim.
Mm-hmm.
They argue that a broken geopolitical order doesn't actually start in the government. It starts, well, at your breakfast table.
Right, which is wild to think about.
Yeah, it's wild. It basically says if you are tyrannizing your spouse, these texts argue that you are structurally identical to a corrupt dictator.
Wow.
And your entire claim to wanting social justice is just mathematically void.
It is a radical reframing of how we understand power and justice. I mean, we are so used to compartmentalizing our lives,
Right.
We put our domestic life in one box, our spiritual life in another, and then global politics is in some heavily guarded vault.
Yeah, totally separate.
Totally separate. But these sources argue that reality simply doesn't work that way.
Right. And that's what makes this deep dive so utterly fascinating. We're analyzing a pair of texts today, specifically Marriage and Social Justice in.pdf and Closing Instructions.pdf.
Mm-hmm.
And these documents, they operate as a complete, 360-degree architectural blueprint of human society.
They really do.
They connect the most intimate, quiet details of domestic life, literally how you speak to your partner when you're annoyed in the kitchen, directly to the macro mechanics of cosmic law and global sovereignty.
And what's crucial to understand as we unpack this is that the texts are functioning like a structural engineering audit.
Okay.
They aren't just moralizing, right? They are breaking down the physics and the mechanics of how human societies either align with natural law or inevitably collapse into tyranny.
Yeah, and before we get too deep into the weeds here, I want to set a quick ground rule for the listener.
Good idea.
Because these texts deal with, really intense theological, political, and systemic ideologies.
Very intense.
Yeah. So our goal for this deep dive is strictly to act as impartial guides. We are not endorsing or taking sides, left-wing, right-wing, whatever.
Okay.
We are just exploring and reporting on the fascinating internal logic and architecture of this provided source material.
Right. We're just mapping out the blueprint they've given us.
Exactly. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because if the premise is that global justice starts in the living room, we have to look at how this blueprint designs that living room. Where does a unified theory of social justice actually begin?
Well, it begins with the concept of Khilafah, which is often translated as a divine just order.
Okay.
Now, secular political theory would tell you that a just order is established through a constitution or a revolution.
Right, like signing a document.
Exactly. But this framework states that the divine just order cannot possibly be established on earth unless justice is first maintained within marriage.
Wow, that is a massive amount of pressure to put on a Tuesday night dinner with your spouse.
It really is.
Yeah.
But the text backs it up by citing a famous prophetic tradition that refers to marriage as half-deen.
Half-deen.
Right? Mishkat 3096. Meaning the way you conduct your marriage constitutes half of your entire religious operating system.
Half of your entire spiritual reality hinges on how you treat this one other person.
Ethically.
And the text uses this brilliant, incredibly vivid metaphor to drive this home, the metaphor of dividing the apple in half.
Yeah, that part really stands out. What's fascinating here is how this metaphor exposes modern hypocrisy.
Oh, totally.
The text argues that if you are out in the streets, striving for global socio-political justice, protesting, demanding human rights, but simultaneously you are maintaining oppression, conflict, or injustice inside your own home. You are fracturing Tawheed.
Tawheed being the indivisible oneness of God,
right?
And the absolute unity of his system.
Precisely. You cannot divide a unified system.
Right.
The text says trying to separate public justice from private justice is like cutting an apple in half, handing the bruised, rotting half to Allah, and expecting it to be accepted as a complete offering.
Wow.
Logically, within this framework, it is rejected entirely.
It's basically the ultimate takedown of the performative activist.
It really is.
Like, you can't be a champion of human rights on social media and a tyrant to your family in private. The text literally describes outward religious or political activism as totally hollow if your domestic life is built on coercion.
And this brings us to the internal mechanisms of how this domestic justice actually operates.
Okay, let's hear it.
The text uses three foundational pillars for the home. First, Adl, which is strict justice. Second, Ihsan, which is excellence or going above and beyond through grace.
Right.
And third, Taqwa, which is God consciousness. But all of these serve to generate one supreme domestic condition, which the text calls Sakinah.
Sakinah. Yeah, the text points to Surah 30.21 for that, noting that spouses are created to find comfort in one another and that compassion and mercy are actively placed between them.
Yes.
But in English, I mean, we often just translate Sakinah as peace, which to a lot of modern couples just means, well, we aren't screaming at each other today.
Right, right.
It implies a sort of passive roommate situation. So please elaborate on Sakinah. Does the text mean more than just not fighting?
Oh, it means so much more. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Sakinah is not a passive ceasefire.
Okay.
It is an active sanctuary. It is a deep-seated, mutual psychological safety. The text is actually ruthless in its assessment here. It argues that if your marriage is treated as an adversarial battlefield where you are constantly keeping score, then all your outward worship is rendered worthless.
Wow, worthless.
Yeah, because the absence of Sakinah proves that your relationship is out of alignment with the natural divine order.
So the home isn't just a place to sleep. The home is basically an incubator.
That is the exact terminology the blueprint implies.
Real.
Yes, the family unit is a highly specialized incubator. It's a training ground.
But training for what? Because normally, secular society views a peaceful home as the finish line. You buy the house, you achieve the peaceful family dynamic, and you say, okay, I made it. I can relax.
Sure. Yeah.
But this text says the peaceful home is just the preparation phase.
And this raises an important question, and it's where the living room connects to the cosmos.
Okay, I'm with you.
The family unit is cultivating this extreme noble character and empathy to prepare its members for their ultimate objective, which is helping Prophet Muhammad establish Deen-e-Haq.
Deen-e-Haq, meaning the ultimate system of divine truth and social justice that overrides all oppressive ideologies.
Correct. The text points out in Surah 21.1-7 that the Prophet was sent as a mercy to all creation.
Right.
Therefore, the peaceful, merciful home is the factory that produces individuals who are actually capable of spreading that universal mercy to the rest of the world.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, if you cannot show mercy to the person sitting across from you at the breakfast table, you are structurally unqualified to handle the mechanics of global justice.
That makes perfect logical sense. You can't export a product you haven't manufactured.
Exactly.
And the text provides a very clear roadmap for this, which it calls the 4 pillars of ultimate success, drawn from Surah Al-Araf 7.157.
Right, right.
And I don't want to just list these because the psychology behind them is what's really compelling. It mentions belief, honor, help, and following the light. Let's drill into a couple of these.
Let's do it.
Take honor. The text uses the term tazir, meaning deep reverence and etiquette toward the messenger's status. How does honoring a prophet practically dismantle a toxic ego in a modern household?
Well, think about the mechanics of an ego.
Okay.
An ego wants to be the absolute authority in a room.
Naturally.
When an entire family collectively agrees to honor a standard of character that is universally higher than their own desires, a prophetic standard, it democratizes the household in a beautiful way.
Oh, I see.
The husband cannot say, I am the ultimate standard, because the family has already established that the prophet's character is the standard. It creates a ceiling on arrogance.
Oh, I love that. It's basically a built-in defense mechanism against domestic tyranny.
Exactly.
And then there's the third pillar, nusra, which means active help or support in establishing Deen-e-Haq.
Yes, and practically, this means organizing your family life, your finances, your time, your education in a way that actively aids the triumph of divine social justice.
So it's not just about paying the bills.
Right. That's asking, is our family unit a net positive for universal justice?
And the text explicitly states that this mission prioritizes social justice over mere punitive penalties.
Yes, very clearly.
It emphasizes the absolute sanctity of life, noting from Surah 5.32 that saving one life is mathematically equivalent to saving all of humanity. That is a staggering scale of empathy to nurture at home.
It is.
Yeah.
But it inevitably leads us to a highly practical problem.
Which is?
You have this beautiful, empathetic incubator. But any institution, no matter how loving, requires a structure to function.
Right. Who actually steers the ship?
Yeah.
Because empathy without structure usually just turns into chaos.
And this is where the text introduces a concept that requires very careful, nuanced unpacking. Yeah. Because it directly challenges modern sensibilities.
Right.
It brings in the concept of Qawwam from Surah An-Nisa 4.34, specifically regarding structural leadership.
Okay, here we go. What exactly is Qawwam in this blueprint?
The text acknowledges a basic institutional reality, which is that no organization can function effectively with two conflicting heads.
Right, there has to be a tiebreaker.
Exactly. So men are designated as caretakers or Qawwam. But the massive foundational caveat in this document is that this is strictly defined as a servant leader role.
Okay. It's rooted in consultation, protective care, and the explicit requirement that men are financially responsible for the family's maintenance. And in harmony with this, the text describes righteous women as devoutly obedient, guarding what needs to be guarded in the husband's absence. Now, I have to push back here.
Go for it.
Because to modern ears, terms like obedience and structural leadership sound a lot like a boss and an employee, or worse, a dictator and a subject. How does this blueprint fundamentally differ from standard male chauvinism?
What's fascinating here is how aggressively the text attacks that exact authoritarian mindset.
Really?
It states explicitly that true chivalry and genuine manhood means self-sacrifice and restraint. It draws a massive, uncrossable line between genuine manhood and male chauvinism.
Okay.
It defines chauvinism as a sickness of the ego, just seeking power, dominance, and control over others.
Right. The text has a great phrase for that authoritarian behavior. It calls it toxic legalism.
Exactly. The text argues that using your structural authority to coerce or dominate your partner is weaponizing Qawwam. It is relying on cold transactional logic. Like, I have this legal right, you have this legal duty, therefore you must comply. The text argues that this toxic legalism serves Satan, not God.
Because it completely suppresses the fitra, the natural disposition of the family.
Exactly.
If you are ruling your house through fear or a rigid spreadsheet of entitlements, you might technically be following the law, but you are destroying the spirit.
Right. And coercive control creates an environment where faith remains entirely superficial. It never penetrates the heart.
Yeah.
The text states that Jannah, paradise, is reserved exclusively for the Muttaqin, the righteous and God-conscious. And a core trait of the Muttaqin is how they resolve domestic friction.
Because friction is inevitable. You are two human beings sharing a bathroom.
Exactly. And the text says, drawing from Surah 64.14, you resolve that friction through deliberate pardon, overlooking faults, and extending mercy. You do not resolve it by citing legal clauses at each other.
There was a specific case study in the text that perfectly illustrates this collision between toxic legalism and what the blueprint calls Ihsan, or grace.
Ah, yes.
Is about caring for elderly parents. Can you walk us through that? Because this is where the theoretical framework hits the messy reality of modern life.
It's a brilliant, highly practical example. The text establishes that caring for parents is an absolute top-tier priority in the divine framework, cited right alongside monotheism itself in Surahs 2.83 and 17.23.
Right.
Now, in strict minimalist commercial law, basic fiqh, a wife is not legally obligated to take care of her husband's parents.
Right. If we are looking purely at a legal contract, it is not her job.
Precisely. But the husband is required to work to provide the financial maintenance of the home. He cannot physically be there all day.
Yeah.
So if the wife relies strictly on that minimalist legalism and says, well, not my contract, not my problem, what happens?
Massive domestic friction. The husband is torn between his divine obligation to his parents and his marital reality. Resentment builds.
And the text argues that this minimalist legalism breeds that exact resentment and totally violates the spirit of family solidarity. It's technically legal, but it is relationally toxic.
Right.
Instead, the text champions voluntary Ihsan from Surah 2.195, gracious sacrifice and excellence.
It is asking her to surrender a legal right for the sake of special harmony, to step in and graciously assist, not because a court forces her to, but out of love for the divine and a desire to build lasting affection.
And the text explicitly says that this attitude of gracious sacrifice, this voluntary excellence, is what actually earns ultimate success. It requires moving beyond rigid transactional rights.
And the text doesn't just present this as a nice idea, it brings an overwhelming barrage of prophetic traditions to back it up.
It does. It cites numerous hadith from Tirmidhi, Muslim, Bukhari, and Bayhaqi, and they all hammer the exact same theme.
Yeah.
The best of you are those who are best to their wives. He who is deprived of tender feelings is in fact deprived of all good.
Oh.
It defines all of creation as the family of God and states that God loves those most who are kindest to his creation.
Tender feelings as a structural requirement for leadership, it's incredible. The entire thesis here is that universal mercy and extreme gentleness are the strict prerequisites for any legitimate claim to authority.
Without gentleness, your authority is just tyranny disguised as religion.
Okay, so we've built this incredibly just, empathetic household. We have rejected toxic legalism. We have embraced grace and Sakinah. The incubator is running perfectly. But eventually, this family has to open the front door. They have to interact with the macro society, with the state. What happens when this deeply empathetic individual steps into the modern political world?
This is where the blueprint shifts from the micro to the macro, and the transition is intentionally jarring.
Okay.
Because the text introduces a massive structural tension between two completely incompatible loyalties. On one side, you have al-Hub and Lila, which is a profound, borderless love for the divine and a universal brotherhood of humanity.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have wataniyat, which is nationalism.
Nationalism. Now, the text doesn't just say nationalism is a flawed political theory. It drops a massive theological hammer on the concept. It classifies wataniyat as a modern Taqwa.
Yes. Tawheed essentially means a tyrannical idol, or a false deity.
Right.
It is anything that crosses its limits and sets itself up as a supreme authority above divine law, referenced in Surahs 9.31 and 4.60.
But why? I mean, to a modern listener, loving your country seems perfectly normal. Why is a nation-state considered an idol in this blueprint?
Think about what a nation-state structurally does.
Okay.
It creates artificial imaginary lines on the earth, and it uses those lines to fracture the universal human brotherhood we just talked about.
Oh.
It says, the person on this side of the invisible line is worthy of your resources and loyalty, and the person on the other side is an alien or an enemy.
It demands a supreme allegiance that overrides human empathy.
Exactly. If you are placing the interests of a nation-state, protecting its borders, boosting its secular economy, above universal divine justice, you have essentially replaced the worship of God with the worship of the state.
Oh.
You are treating the nation as an idol that dictates right and wrong.
So what does this all mean? Does this blueprint demand a rejection of all modern society?
No.
Like, if the nation-state is an idol, is the text arguing that modern knowledge, science, economics, and statecraft are inherently evil and must be destroyed?
No, and this is a crucial distinction. The text uses a very specific parameter to clarify this, which is known as the Iqbal distinction.
The Iqbal distinction.
Right. It separates human progress into two completely different categories: hardware and software.
This was a brilliant analogy. I want to play with this for a second. So secular statecraft, modern infrastructure, the scientific method, all of that is just acquired knowledge.
Yes. Acquired knowledge is classified purely as neutral hardware.
So it's essentially just a blank laptop. A ridiculously powerful laptop with incredible processing power. But a laptop has no inherent morality.
Exactly. A supercomputer doesn't care what it computes.
Right.
It can be used to coordinate an international organ transplant network, or it can be used to calculate the trajectory of a ballistic missile aimed at a hospital. The hardware is blind.
It requires an operating system to tell it what to do. And if you install a corrupt operating system, like Watania, nationalism, or predatory capitalism, that laptop is going to use all its processing power to build border walls, exploit the poor, and manufacture weapons.
Precisely. Which is why the text is absolutely rigid on this next point.
Okay.
The only acceptable operating system, the divine software of social justice that must direct this hardware, is strictly and always Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen-e-Islam.
Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen-e-Islam. That is the mandatory software.
Yes.
Without that specific operating system, human intelligence just builds more efficient ways to oppress people.
Because without that divine software, the hardware will inevitably be hijacked by the modern Taqwa.
Okay, this brings us to the most explosive part of the entire deep dive. The final document, the closing instructions, which functions as an ultimate, grand-scale, systemic audit of global sovereignty.
Yes, the grand audit.
We've scaled up from the living room to the nation-state, and now we are looking at the fundamental mechanics of supreme law itself.
And I cannot overstate how clinically this audit is written. It is laid out like a mathematical proof.
Oh, yeah, it really is.
It leaves absolutely zero room for ambiguity. It analyzes exactly how laws are generated in a society.
It sets up strict comparative rules. Let's look at the mechanics of supreme law according to this audit. Let's start with the secular baseline. Under the current secular nationalist model, how does a law actually get enacted?
The audit states that under secularism, national constitutions place the authority to make laws under a very specific fabricated entity.
Okay.
And we must use the exact terminology of the text here. Under secularism, law is enacted in the name of a country-state flag god idol.
A country-state flag god idol. It treats the flag and the abstract state it represents as a literal functional deity in the legal system.
Yes.
The ultimate source of authority.
Yes. Furthermore, the audit points out that allegiance is pledged directly to this country-state flag god idol.
Right.
And the text pulls no punches here. It explicitly links this pledge of allegiance to serving Iblis, or Satan, from Surah 4.117, because you are pledging ultimate loyalty to a human fabrication rather than the creator.
Okay, so that is the mechanical reality of secularism.
Yeah.
In contrast, what is the required structural baseline under Islam?
The audit states that under Islam, supreme law must be enacted solely in the name of Allah.
Right.
It sets a foundational Quranic principle, Surah 18.26, stating that Allah does not let anyone share in his command because he is the sole creator and owner of the universe.
He has an absolute divine monopoly on sovereignty.
Exactly. Therefore, allegiance is pledged only to Allah, which functions practically through allegiance to a Khilafah, a righteous human steward, as cited in Muslim 1851.
Let's trace the actual physical mechanics of how a fake law comes into existence under the secular model.
Okay, let's do it.
Because the text argues you can't just spontaneously generate a law that violates natural justice. It requires a mechanical sequence.
It is a rigid law of cause and effect. Step 1. You have to invent the source of authority. You invent the country-state flag god idol.
Because humans intuitively know they can't just make things up, so they invent an abstract idol to take the blame.
Right.
But a flag can't speak. An abstract state doesn't have a voice.
Which leads to step 2. The idol requires a takat mouthpiece. This is a leader, a politician, or a parliament acting as a fake authority, claiming to speak on behalf of the idol.
Like saying, I am doing this in the name of the state.
Exactly. And once you have the false god and the false mouthpiece, you arrive at step 3, which is the generation of fake or man-made law.
The text uses the legalization of riba, usury, or predatory interest as its primary example here.
Yes, riba is strictly, fundamentally forbidden in divine law because it mathematically guarantees the exploitation of the poor.
Right.
But the takat mouthpiece passes it anyway, legalizing it in the name of the country-state flag god idol, completely bypassing divine sovereignty, specifically bypassing 18.26.
It's a structural bypass system. The text calls this structural shirk, associating partners with God on a systemic level.
Precisely.
So if this is a mechanical error, what is the mechanical solution? How does the blueprint propose fixing a corrupted constitution?
The text demands a complete structural bifurcation of the Constitution. It must be split into 2 distinct dimensions.
Part 1 and Part 2.
Yes. Part 1 is the immutable code. This is the Quran and the Sunnah.
Okay.
It contains the eternal, unchangeable principles of justice. There are absolutely 0 edits allowed to Commission. Part 1.
The non-negotiables. The operating system core.
Exactly.
And Part 2.
Part 2 is adaptable statecraft. These are the fluid working policies, the administrative regulations, the traffic laws, the economic management, things that must evolve with time and technology.
The hardware application.
Exactly. But, and this is the critical mechanical fix that prevents tyranny, Part 2 must remain strictly and functionally subordinate to Part 1.
By clearly separating the eternal divine principles from temporary human administration, you essentially pull the plug on the state's ability to act like a god.
You remove the idol.
Yeah.
And by removing the idol, you mute the tagat mouthpiece.
Wow.
It completely strips away the artificial authority required to commit structural oppression.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Because the blueprint doesn't just rely on political or legal theory to prove this point. It actually turns to physics.
Physics just.
It introduces a stunning analogy based on Surah Fussilat, verse 53.
The verse states, "We will show them our signs in the universe, in the horizons, and in their own selves, until it becomes manifest to them that this is the absolute truth."
The text uses this verse to create a literal physical laboratory proof. Let's break down the first part of that verse, the signs in the horizons. The text uses this to introduce the physics analogy of light and shadow. Let's unpack this.
Okay, so in this physical analogy, light represents natural law.
Okay.
And natural law, the text mandates, is strictly Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen-e-Islam. The light is the unchangeable truth of the universe.
Okay. And the shadow?
The shadow represents fake law. It represents the legalization of riba, or the drawing of artificial borders, or the normalization of domestic tyranny.
But structurally, a shadow isn't a physical thing. It has no mass. It's simply an absence of light.
Right. And here's the physical proof. A shadow cannot possibly exist in reality unless there is a physical object blocking the light source.
Oh, I see where this is going. So
Yeah.
what is the physical object casting the shadow of corruption over our legal systems?
The country-state flag god idol. That fabricated idol is the physical ideological anchor blocking the radiant truth of Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen-e-Islam.
Wow.
Just as a shadow requires an object to exist, a fake law cannot structurally manifest without anchoring a country-state flag god idol to block the divine light.
And the text argues that if you mechanically subtract that idol, if you implement that constitutional bifurcation we just discussed, what physically happens to the shadow?
Removing the anchor causes the shadow to vanish instantly.
Right, because there's nothing to block the light anymore.
Exactly. Removing the idol causes the fake laws to lose their structural integrity and collapse.
That is a staggering, beautiful way to visualize constitutional law. It treats systemic oppression as a physics problem that can be solved by removing the object blocking the light.
It's brilliant.
But the verse in Surah Fussilat doesn't stop at the horizons. It explicitly mentions signs in their own selves, the inner selves, the psychological proof.
Yes.
And this brings us to what the text calls the delegation paradox.
And this is where the entire secular framework mathematically falls apart.
Okay.
The delegation paradox deals with the internal psychological logic of human beings.
Wait, let me make sure I am grasping this, because when I read this part of the text, it totally blew my mind.
It's intense, yeah.
The text argues that every single human being intuitively knows that they, as an individual, possess zero natural authority to alter the laws of the universe.
Exactly. You, as a human, cannot vote to change the boiling point of water.
Right.
And similarly, you possess absolutely zero inherent authority to legalize theft or to alter internal moral realities. Your authority to change natural law is zero.
Okay, so if I possess zero authority to make laws against nature, and my neighbor possesses zero authority,
So how can a collection of individuals delegate an authority they do not possess to a politician?
that is the paradox. The text poses it as a simple mathematical equation. 0 plus 0 equals 0.
Right.
Millions of individuals walking into a voting booth to delegate an authority they fundamentally lack mathematically still equals 0.
It is a mathematical impossibility to delegate a power you don't have.
Yeah.
Therefore, the text argues that the entire concept of a secular representative democracy legislating against natural law is a mathematical myth, is a mass cognitive dissonance.
We are just delegating a power we mathematically do not possess. So to cope with this rebellion against our own internal logic, what do?
We invent the country-state flag god idol. We invent a psychological fiction to bypass our own internal knowledge that we lack this authority. We create the idol to bear the weight of our impossible math.
Which brings us to the final explosive synthesis of this entire 360-degree blueprint.
The texts argue, conclusively, that it is mathematically, physically, and structurally impossible to enact a false law without first inventing a false god to authorize it.
Because you always need that object to cast the shadow. You always need the false god to balance the false equation of 0 plus 0.
Exactly. And this inevitable structural reality, the observable fact that fake laws always require fake gods, provides undeniable empirical proof of three profound realities.
Okay, what are they?
First, it proves that Allah exists as the sole source of actual authority. Second, it proves that the Quran is HAQ, the absolute truth, as referenced in surahs 10.32, 22.6, and 22.62.
And the third reality.
It proves that Deen-e-Fitrat, Deen-e-Islam, is the sole, mathematically and structurally sound operating system for human reality. Anything else is just a shadow.
That is an absolutely massive journey we just took.
It really connects every dot of the human experience.
We started in the living room. We talked about how a husband and a wife navigate the friction of caring for elderly parents, choosing voluntary grace over toxic legalism, ensuring they don't fracture Tawheed by being tyrants at breakfast.
Holding the incubator for universal mercy.
Right. And we followed that thread of empathy out the front door. We watched it collide with the artificial borders of nationalism, and we followed it all the way up to the mathematical destruction of state idols and the cosmic physics of light and shadow. It truly is a unified blueprint of everything.
It demands total integration.
Yeah.
You cannot separate the self, the family, and the cosmos. They all require the exact same operating system to function without collapsing.
And whether you view this architecture as a profound, beautiful revelation of ultimate social justice, or, as a deeply challenging disruption of everything you've been taught about modern politics, it is completely impossible to deny the staggering internal consistency of the logic presented in these sources.
The structural integrity of the blueprint is flawless.
Yeah.
It is engineered with absolute precision from the micro to the macro.
It really is. So we'll leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. The next time you look at the structures governing your daily life, whether it's the transactional, legalistic arguments you might be having in your own relationships, or the unquestioned, towering authority of a national border, ask yourself a fundamental physics question. Are you looking at the light of natural truth, or are you just staring at a shadow cast by an idol?